We're live.
All right. Julie, you can just come up and get set up. This Senate Education Committee on the afternoon of January 28th, we're going to spend an hour or so with Richter from JFO, just really learning. We've never done it in this committee, but I can, as I recall, really had a primer on how the excess spending virtual works. It's because it's possible it's something we'll be talking about as we go forward with systems change. It's probably important for us to have the base understanding of how excess spending threshold actually works. So with that, some sort of introduction. We know everybody. We all know each other. So,
Yeah.
Floor is yours.
All right.
I know you have your a standard presentation.
I do. Yeah. So, good to see you all. I'm Julia from the Joint Fiscal Office. I'm Julia Richter from the Joint Fiscal Office. Been working with Zoom for years, but apparently still learning curve. So yeah, so as the chair mentioned, there is a presentation on the excess spending adjustment on the committee page under my name. Chair Bongartz, would you like me to share my screen or?
Yeah, why don't you share your screen?
Okay.
That way people can see it. Those who are opportunities.
So this presentation really is an overview of the excess spending adjustment that we have in current law. As you know, we are a nonpartisan fiscal office. And so the way I've structured it and hope that it will help walk through sort of how we think about the excess spending adjustment is first a review of how property taxes work under current law. And what I mean by under current law, it's pre-Act 73, the education finance system that we are all operating in this fiscal year. And then talking about the excess spending adjustment under current law. And then lastly, what is the history of the excess spending adjustment and threshold? So this is a reminder of what we spoke about, I think, last year when we came in and did an education fund and education finance primer. Pulled some of these slides from that. So we know that education tax rates, property tax rates, are set to make sure the education fund is fully balanced. And what that means is we take all of the expenditures that we need to pay out of the education fund, all of the school budgets, all of the categorical aid, everything. And then we subtract out our non-property revenues. So meals and rooms, a portion of that, sales and use, etc. And the remainder needs to be raised somehow. And it's raised by property taxes through the yield bill. Under current law, of course, Act 73 changes this, but under current law, there's two property tax groups or bases that are subject to an education property tax. And the rates associated with each of these classifications differ. So there's the non-homestead property, and then there's homestead property. Homestead is essentially where somebody lives, the house that they live in, and all of the surrounding acreage to that homestead. Non-homestead is literally everything else that's subject to property tax. So that includes parking lots, apartments, second homes, businesses, deer camp, everything. So this is the non-homestead property tax. So if it doesn't qualify as homestead and it's taxable for education property tax, it's taxed at the non-homestead rate. This rate is uniform across all towns at the equalized level, meaning that if that property were to be assessed at 100% fair market value, that's what we're charging the tax bill based off of. The rate is technically it's set in statute at $1.59, but every year that rate is annually now withstood in the yield bill and session bond. And the amount that's raised on non-homestead and the amount that's raised on homestead is a policy choice we will grapple with every year in the yield bill. Homestead property tax. So this is the tax that we're going to be talking about when we're talking about excess spending adjustment. So this is that tax on real property that qualifies as a homestead. So that principal dwelling and surrounding land. And the tax rate for homestead properties is a locally adjusted tax rate based off of per pupil spending and divided by, which varies by district. And then the state divided by the statewide yield. Per pupil spending, that's a technical term. So that's education spending divided by the weighted pupil count. So education spending, you'll recall, is essentially a school district's budget minus all of its offsetting revenues. So minus the categorical aid it's receiving, minus any funds that they're pulling from reserves, minus tuition revenues they're receiving from another school district. Whatever's left over is called education spending. And this is the numerator of that per pupil spending calculation. The denominator?
Can you just do that once more?
Yeah. Sure. Well, how education spending is calculated? So education spending is calculated by taking the school district's entire budget and subtracting all of its offsetting revenues. Offsetting revenues are essentially revenues that have a specific reason that they are coming to the district. So offsetting revenues includes special education grants. It includes the transportation reimbursements. It includes flexible pathways funding. It includes federal categorical aid. It also includes tuition revenues that another school district may have paid in. All of those revenues that are associated with something specific are our offsetting revenues. The remainder is education spending.
So if we had $1 million budget and 100,000 coming in from all these other, we're going to work on $900,000 for our education budget.
For education spending, yeah.
Education spending.
So education spending, and this is where I know people get frustrated in education finance with all of the technical terms. In Vermont Ed Finance, education spending is a technical term that is capturing exactly what you just said. The budget minus those offsetting revenues, that 900,000.
So this would take almost to your question, but when you have somebody paying tuition and that gets knocked off in that first, then how do we know that is that tuition accounting for improvements in that upped it? Because we had one superintendent say, when we do any improvements, it's in the tuition cost.
So
But-
I can't comment to that specific testimony because I didn't hear it.
Right.
Broadly, say we have two school districts, School District A and School District B. School District A sends students to School District B and sends tuition also to School District B to cover the education of those students. That means that District A, who's sending the students, we also call that the sending district. Those tuition costs will be included in their education spending. Their budget, and there's not a specific revenue
Of A.
of A, exactly.
So they don't lose those dollars when they're doing their budget. They don't subtract them because
In
I see.
District A, they don't, because it's an education cost. It's sitting in their school district budget, and there are no specific revenue. Sure, there might be specific revenue for like special education or something, but just for the general education, there's not a specific offsetting revenue to pay the tuition of that student. So that's District A. District B, who is receiving those students, we call that receiving district. They're receiving those tuition revenues for educating those students. And those tuition revenues are sitting in their offsetting revenues. That's what they are classified as. So they're being subtracted from the budget as offsetting revenues to get to education spending. Does that answer the question?
it does. It has another question in there, but you've answered the question. So
Okay. Okay. So that's our numerator when we're calculating the per pupil spending or per weighted pupil spending. The denominator is the long-term weighted average daily membership, LTWADM, which essentially is the total weighted pupil count. It's the way to think about it is on average over 2 years, the number of kids in that school district, or that the number of kids that school district is responsible for, plus all of the weights applied to those students. So recall, we've got those weights for students from economically disadvantaged backgrounds, English learners. And then we have grade level weights under current law, and you implemented some other weights for the foundation. So then I think this is the last sort of reminder slide of homestead property taxes. So I'm a person who thinks in equations. I know other people think in words. The equation and the word essentially say the same thing. What we're looking at here is how is the homestead property tax rate calculated? So we see that the per pupil education spending varies by district. And we just spoke about how it's calculated, right? It's the education spending divided by the weighted pupil count. So that's varying by district. And then every district's per pupil's education spending is divided by the statewide property yield, which you all are setting annually in the yield bill. And that's how we are calculating the homestead property tax rate. So now when we start talking about the excess spending adjustment, we'll be talking about within this equation, how does the excess spending adjustment impact the property tax rates? Spoiler alert, it fits into the numerator, but we'll talk about it in a bit. Okay, so that was a quick review of homestead property tax. Are we good with that? Okay. So moving into the excess spending adjustment under current law. So we have something called the excess spending adjustment under current law. People also refer to it as the excess spending penalty. Some people refer to it as the excess spending threshold. It's all talking about the same concept. Essentially what it does is it creates a double tax on the amount that a school district spends per weighted pupil above the excess spending threshold. So we look at the excess spending threshold, we look at how much a school district is spending above that, and then however much they're spending above that is double taxed. The threshold is calculated annually in fiscal year 27. So the fiscal year we're looking forward to setting the property tax rates for, and that school districts are currently building their budgets for. The excess spending threshold is $16,470 per weighted pupil. And we'll talk about how the threshold is calculated and how the adjustment actually double taxes that amount. So
the threshold is set based on the spending the prior year.
Not the spending the prior year. This is how it's set.
Okay.
So this was a change a few years ago in I actually don't remember. I don't remember which act, but this was a recent change where the excess spending threshold is now calculated by taking the average per weighted pupil spending in fiscal year 2025, increasing that average spending by inflation. We use the NIPA index, and then multiplying that inflation adjusted average spending by 118%. And that's how we get to the excess spending threshold.
What was it? Oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
No, was it before 127?
It wasn't 127. The latter half of the slide talks about what it was before. It was, I think, 121% before. The challenge is, I would caution you all to directly compare what we have now for the excess spending threshold and what we had before, because it was applying to different funding schemes. So the prior excess spending threshold was the old weights, pre-Act 127.
Okay.
And this is the current weights, post-Act 127. And because I changed the way that pupil weights are calculated, you probably remember equalized pupil, we did away with the innovation ratio.
Yeah.
So it's not necessarily apples to apples.
Okay. I'm always amazed how much you paid more ahead.
Well, thank you. And it is one area, so it's easier to, dive a little bit deeper. So that's how the threshold is calculated. So when we're calculating the FY27 threshold, we're saying, okay, the 13,168, which is the FY25 per pupil spending, we're increasing it by inflation for 2 years because now we're looking forward to FY27, and then we're multiplying it by 18%.
What's that? Is that our next slide? What is that? What is the number?
It was, it's right here.
So we go from 13 to 16.
Mhm.
Okay, with 118%. NIPA plus on.
with the NIPA and the 100 acre. Yeah. So what is exempt from the excess spending adjustment? Under current law, there's only one exemption. And this is all principal and interest payments for any voter approved bonds that were approved prior to July 1, 2024. So, that date was set because it was essentially saying anything that's been approved prior to us adjusting the excess spending threshold, we're going to exempt that, but anything approved after, we won't. I want to note that this exemption of the principal and interest payments for voter approved bonds is only for the calculation of excess spending. It's not for the calculation of that per pupil spending we were talking about. So there still is that tax being calculated based off of those bond payments, but those bond payments are not subject to a double tax. So this is how it's applied to a school district's tax rate. So as we spoke about, if the per pupil spending is greater than the excess spending threshold, then we take the per pupil amount over the threshold after subtracting out those exemptions, and essentially they're counted twice. And that's done by adding them to the numerator of that property tax rate equation, right? So we have that original per pupil education spending plus per pupil excess spending. So we know that the excess spending is already sitting within that per pupil education spending. We're just adding it a second time to make sure it's double counted. And then divided by the statewide yield. So this is the mechanism for the excess spending adjustment. Where
So does that
It's hard.
translate to dollar per dollar if you're over?
No, not necessarily. So, so we're just thinking about the way that this works. Is, and I do have an example on the next slide,
Okay.
which might be helpful. But we're really looking at adjusting a ratio. The homestead property tax rate is essentially a ratio of the per pupil spending to the statewide yield, right? If the per pupil spending is double the statewide yield, then the equalized rate will be $2, because that's the way that the fraction works out. So we're adding in this, we're double counting the excess spending. Calculating
That's the way that was supposed to. Okay, yeah. Yes,
On the previous slide, can you go back to, under current law, the exemption is all principal and interest payments for any voter approved bonds that were approved prior to July 21. Can you give me an example of the bond?
Off the top of my head, I don't have a specific school district bond. I can certainly follow up with you about that. Like the general conceptual example.
So if we took a bond out in one of my district schools for improvements of a high school or something, ADA or whatever, that's included in that calculation.
If it was approved prior to July 1, 2024. If it was approved yesterday,
So when we were up in Canaan, they said they went over their spending because of a repair or something. Remember, she said we
Gonna take a ride on it.
right, they had to take a bond out or something after, so they got penalized. And that's just because of the way we made the law, that we weren't able to, because they're already struggling and then they got taxed even more or penalized.
yeah, so this is all a policy decision.
Okay.
This is the law as it currently exists. And what this law says is for every dollar that you spend below the threshold, you're taxed once. For every dollar you spend above the threshold, you're taxed twice, except for these approved bonds. And it doesn't matter as long as it's not fitting into the exemption. It doesn't matter if that additional spending is for a new program or for a repair.
And I want to say we ran into the same thing down at Woodstock too, correct? They had to do a repair, which puts them above their excess spending. And they were like, can't we get this detached so that if this comes up,
yeah, they're worried about that because they need actually a water bond and capacity to do what they're looking to do. So,
Okay. So that's something in policy we could amend.
yeah, and England had a lot of other things going on too that pushed it a little bit. Right. But,
So did we ever, I'm thinking Act 127 now, tell school districts, as long as you don't spend more than 10%, we won't penalize you? Did we ever do that?
Prior to Act 127? Yeah, and the second, we have a couple more slides, and then the second, half of this presentation is exactly
Okay.
what we used to do.
okay.
Mhm. We get to move to the example?
Yeah.
Okay. So. I totally made this example up. I made up all of the numbers, and tried to keep them nice and round and simple. So this is no specific district we're talking about. I made up two districts, District A and District B. And I assume that District B had a per pupil education spending of 15,000 and District B had one of 17,000. We would have calculated that by taking their education spending and dividing it by their weighted pupils. That's how we would get these numbers. And then I said, let's just pretend the excess spending threshold is 16,000 because it's a nice round even number and kind of close to the FY27.
Okay.
So how do we calculate the excess spending threshold, the excess spending adjustment, and how does it work? Well, first we need to look at how much how much is above the threshold. In this case, we're assuming that there was no voter approved bonds. So by subtracting row 1 from row 2, we can see that District A, it's below the excess spending threshold. So there's nothing above it. And in District B, it's $1,000 per weighted pupil above the excess spending threshold. So we know how much is sitting over above the threshold. So now we need to add that excess spending back to the per pupil spending to double count it for the purpose of calculating tax rates. So District A, it had 0 over the threshold. We don't need to double count it. It still has a per weighted pupil spending of 15,000. District B had 1,000 over the excess spending threshold per weighted pupil. So we need to add that 1,000 back to the original 17,000. So we have this adjusted, I don't know what the technical term is for it, this per pupil spending now factoring in the penalty. And so then using this adjusted excess spending per weighted pupil spending, we then calculate the tax rate. So we can see district, and I made up a yield of 9,000. District A would have a tax rate in this example, an equalized rate of $1.67. It's just their weighted per pupil spending divided by the yield. District B would have a homestead tax rate of $2 because we're taking that excess spending adjusted per pupil spend, dividing it by the yield. And then this final row is showing, well, what if there were no excess spending adjustment? We know that District A would have the same rate because we're not double counting anything. District B would have a rate of $1.89 rather than $2 because we're not double counting that 1,000. There's an important caveat here that's pretty weedy, but I'm going to say it anyways and say that if there were no excess spending adjustment, the yield would also need to be adjusted because we would be shifting which districts are raising more or less from their grant lists. So this is perhaps a little bit of a misleading example because I kept the yield the same, but it's a way to see directly how the rates would be adjusted. So that's how it works. And then I thought you might be interested in fiscal year 2026. So the fiscal year that we are currently in. The excess spending threshold was 15,926. So this is per weighted pupil. And there were 6 school districts that exceeded that excess spending threshold.
Are we allowed to know which district those are?
Absolutely. I don't know off the top of my head, but I can follow up in an email.
I think that helps in some ways illustrate that you can get penalized because you just have a low number of students. in
Well,
the
one of them, by that, one we know is Cambridge.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So I think it helps to look at all six and make sure that hypothesis is true, but I believe it's generally true.
Yeah.
The fewer number of students you have, the more likely you're going to get hit by this.
Or repair. You can't, if they repair one city with that, they pay it. It drives up the cost.
Oh, you mean like an after the fact
Yeah.
repair, like you were saying? Yeah.
That's exactly it, yeah. Per pupil spending has two input. The education spending and the weighted pupil count. And so either one or a combination of the two is how you have that go up.
Julie's very good at making people feel smart. Also, that's important in this conversation.
Oh, thank you. So I will follow up with the 6 school districts. I just don't have it in front of me. And the amount that those school districts exceeded the threshold really varied. And so what I put here is the district that exceeded the threshold by the lowest amount was exceeding by $429 per weighted pupil. And the school district that exceeded the threshold by the most, exceeded it by $1,582 per weighted pupil. So that's all I prepared for the excess spending threshold under current law. And now you've had some questions about history of excess spending threshold. So here we go.
Yeah, before you transition.
Yeah.
Where does the excess spending tax, the excess spending itself, where's the tax go? The amount collected from this.
To the education fund.
Okay.
So that's a really interesting point. That I was just alluding to on the prior slide about how the yield needs to adjust. We're only talking about homestead property taxes. So all homestead property tax at the state level goes to the statewide education fund. We talked about how the amount that needs to be raised on property taxes is determined after accounting for expenditures and non-property revenues. We have some pie we have to fill. How you fill that pie is a policy decision, both within homestead and the non-homestead. And then within homestead, the way that the excess spending adjustment works is it's not raising additional revenue for the education fund beyond what it needs, because we're calculating the yield to make sure that ed fund is fully funded. Instead, it's shifting which districts are paying a proportion to the ed fund.
So there was nothing, is nothing in Act 73 about directing excess spending to any specific program or benefit to.
There is kind of, which is different than this. I think what you're referencing is the supplemental district spending from Act 73. And that was essentially for school districts that want to spend above the foundation formula amount, the education opportunity payment, and it's approved by voters. That's called supplemental district spending. And that is raised locally on a supplemental district spending tax rate. And the way that that tax rate works is it is equalized to the district with the lowest grand list value per pupil. Meaning that in the school district that has the lowest grand list value per pupil, they're going to just raise exactly what they need. That's how the tax rate is going to be calculated. All of the other districts, they're going to only be able to keep the amount that the lowest district could raise at that tax rate for their district, for their supplemental district spending. And all of the amount that's been raised on top of that, just because there's more property wealth in the district, goes to the state. It's recaptured and goes to the supplemental district spending reserve, which Act 73 that says, and I don't know if this is, I think this is intent language, that is to be used for the buying down the prior year, the following year's property taxes.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so on to the history.
So under Act 73, I thought that some of that money went to the school construction. Did they form a special fund for?
So there was a school construction special fund formed, but there was no revenue source created for the special fund. At one point during the deliberations of Act 73, this is what you got from the House. And then was changed. That recapture that Senator Weeks was asking about was flowing to that school construction special fund. But that was changed before the act was passed. So now it's no longer.
Yes.
So there's an opportunity.
I can't say that.
Okay. So history of excess spending threshold. So this is a general history. I started with Act 127 because where do you start with something like this? Prior to Act 127 froze the excess spending threshold from FY25 to FY29. Prior to Act 127, it was frozen during the pandemic. So it was frozen during the pandemic, and then Act 127 continued the freeze through FY 2029. And then Act 183 in 2024. So this was that big, for those of you who were here, that was that big education and finance yields bill. That was Act 183. It unfroze the excess spending threshold and amended the stabilization exception. And that's what we have now. Is what Act 183 created. And this is that piece I was speaking to earlier, that because the excess spending thresholds calculation and exemptions and the methodology for weighting pupils have significantly shifted pre and post Act 127, we can't really compare the excess spending adjustment prior to Act 127 and post. So with that caveat in mind, here's how it used to work. It was taking the FY15, 2015 average education spending per equalized pupil. So already we're talking about a completely different figure because we're counting pupils differently. Taking that FY25 adjustment, FY15 adjustment, increasing it by inflation, and then multiplying that figure by 121%. And there were also a number of exemptions to the excess spending threshold, and Act 183 did away with all of these exemptions. Beth St. James put together this amazing slide deck that lists out all of the exemptions prior to July 1, 2024, and this is a list of all of the exemptions prior that she identified. So there used to be a lot of exceptions to the excess spending threshold. And Act 183 did away with those. And I do have this as a, oh no. Now, now I've lost my slide. All right, let me pull up my slide deck again. I think I have like one slide left. So I do have a hot link at the end of I do have a hot link within this slide to Beth's great presentation. And then this is how that threshold looked prior to Act 183. So this is what we were talking about, how the excess spending threshold or adjustment was first suspended in FY22 and then continued to be suspended through FY25. And then prior to that, this is what the excess spending threshold looked like. So in FY12, it was sitting down here around 15,000 up to FY21 around 18 something thousand. AOE has all of the data used for this chart available on their website. So if you want to look at exact amounts, you could follow that link. And again, this is per equalized pupil. And that is all. And here are a few resources that I was referencing.
Yeah. So the comment earlier about the 6 districts, districts that have excess money.
That would be a good list to see, just to give us a little bit of background. Where, who it matters to, who it doesn't.
Absolutely. As soon as I'm out of the witness chair, I'm gonna send that list to Daphne. Yeah,
So the other thing that would be interesting to know perhaps is the 10 schools that are right below.
Hmm.
They're at 115 to 118
Hmm.
or whatever.
mhm.
That's an arbitrary number, but give an additional sense of who's close.
Hmm.
Are there a lot of schools in that zone between 100 and 118?
I don't know off the top of my head. I will say that the AOE publishes on their website the per pupil spending data for every year, and so you can see every school district and their per pupil spend, which is per weighted pupil spend data for that year, as well as a few characteristics like the size of the district and the operating structure of the district. So I'll send that link to Daphne too, so that you can look through it to the full level of granularity.
That would be great. Thank you. That was a really good presentation. Understandable.
Oh, good.
Most.
That's the most-
As you-
Until it wasn't. I'm not sure.
Well, I think I'm trying to frame this out, but with the concept, people have seen our forces out of was control school district for cause late yield were cause major progress. You were kind of explaining to us in numbers what was about to happen in 2024. And maybe you did the presentation in 2023. I'm like, I don't want to say too much and be wrong about exactly what it was, but it was like you basically showed us in advance why people were going to be mad in 2024.
I think I don't remember that testimony. I'll think about it. I had to think about what it may have been. Oftentimes we're looking at property tax rate changes compared to the prior year. And so the more one-time money that is used in a single year to decrease property taxes for
Right.
that year, sort of the more artificially low
Right.
property taxes are in that year. So then the following year, assuming that one-time money no longer exists, you both have to make up for the prior year's increase that people didn't feel and the current year's increase.
Right. And the denominator is still going up or
Right. So the yield is an inverse relationship. It's in the denominator. A higher yield, all else equal, means lower tax rate. However, we can't look at the yield just by itself, because you can have property tax rates going down and property tax bills going up
right.
if someone's property value
Right.
is increasing.
Right.
Seen.
Which we also saw in the same time period.
Mhm.
So I mean, one of the things I put in my email to you about things that are helpful for this committee to fully understand, because we bought the property tax rate down so many years in a row is exactly what happens when that stops. Like, yeah.
Yeah, I think everybody gets that. I think everybody understands that.
Oh, okay.
With dollar sensible, but
Numerically, do people understand?
maybe not.
And I think if you combine that, this is what I tried to write to my constituents over and over again. They saw the largest increase in their home prices at the same exact
Same
time.
time. Yep. Yep. So yes,
So I've heard we use the education fund surplus to pay down property taxes. Where's that surplus come from?
So to have used it in the past to buy down property taxes, it is a policy decision to do so. It's education fund monies that are unreserved and unallocated at the close of the fiscal year. So why would that happen? That usually happens if revenues perform more strongly than were forecasted. And or if there are more monies reverted back to the education fund than were assumed. So every year, I've only been here, this is my 5th session. Each of those years, there has been an education fund surplus that has been used, at least in part, to lower property taxes. The amount that it's used, and if it's used in 1 year or more years, varies. When we had the huge education fund surpluses at the tail end of the pandemic, when sales and use was running really hot, you all, or the legislature at the time, put monies into a tax rate offset reserve to use in the following year, anticipating that the surplus would be decreasing.
So if it's not used. We'll get this right. If that is the only thing that we use to pay down property taxes. Conceivably, the rate would be not as, we wouldn't pay it down as much. So the rate of property taxes, education property tax would be lower. So last year, I think we used education surplus plus another surplus from the general fund.
Yep, that's true. That last year there was education fund surplus and a one-time general fund transfer used to decrease property taxes. This year, the December 1 letter, statutorily, there are certain modeling parameters we have to follow for the December 1 letter. Part of that is JFO and tax need to use the entirety of the education fund estimated ed fund surplus to uniformly lower property taxes. And so that was already included in that 11.9 estimated average bill increase. The use of the ed fund surplus was already used for that calculation.
It's always used in the following year.
Solely for the purpose of the December 1 letter calculation. Beyond that, it's up to you all. That's something that I go into finance a lot to talk through the different permutations.
So, but you really can't logistically use it in the current year, right? Because you don't know how much until.
Exactly.
So it has to get carried over at least 1 year.
Yeah, I mean, the way that the yield bill construct is currently modeled is that, and this is also a policy decision, but typically the legislature tries to not leave any monies unreserved, unallocated at the close of the upcoming fiscal year that they're budgeting for. So when we're solving for the yields, we're solving so that there's no money left on the bottom line. Ed fund's not in a deficit, but it also is not running a surplus. And then inevitably, over the year, forecasts are not going to be down to the penny. They're either going to be under or over. And then that's where the surplus or a deficit would arise from.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
So have a couple of minutes because we have 2 witnesses coming together. For one, because the time's still at 2:30. Julie, that would really help.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Always a pleasure.
Always a pleasure.
Is it?
So
It is.
and should we just
You want me to
do we get Jim?
Yes, we can go ahead.
Go off clock. Say we'll be right back. We're just waiting for a witness. So anybody watching, we're going off live, but we'll be back in